Welcome to the National Book Festival's Great Reads from Great Places, brought to you by the Library of Congress and its affiliated Centers for the Book. This is the History Edition. Created by the Centers for the Book of Louisiana, Nebraska, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad you can tune in virtually to the 2021 National Book Festival. I'm Rebecca Manley, and I direct the Texas Center for the Book at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. The Texas Center for the Book is an affiliate of the Library of Congress. The Centers for the Book help carry out the mission of the National Center, which is to promote books, reading, libraries, and literacy nationwide. Great goals, huh? We also promote our state's literary heritage by putting a focus on books and authors with a connection to our states. Each year, as a part of our participation in the Library of Congress National Book Festival, we each choose a book with a local connection. And this is part of the Great Reads from Great Places initiative. So please check that out and learn more about it at read.gov. Today, we are speaking with our great read authors and editors from several states. They were invited by the affiliate centers for the book from Louisiana, Nebraska, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas. All the selected books shine light on significant people and events in history, whether written for children or adults, as fiction or nonfiction. Thus, we're calling this panel Great Reads from Great Places, History Edition. So we want to get into the discussion because our authors are ready, but first let me tell you a little bit about these authors and editors and their books. Representing Louisiana is the unique graphic history, Monumental, Oscar Dunn and His Radical Fight in the Reconstruction, Louisiana, by Brian K. Mitchell. Monumental tells the incredible story of Oscar James Dunn, a New Orleanian born into slavery who became America's first Black lieutenant governor and acting governor. Like his book's subject, Brian K. Mitchell is a New Orleans native, and he is assistant professor of history at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and an associate faculty member at the Anderson Institute on Race and Ethnicity. Welcome, Brian. Nebraska's selection is Your Bridge to History by Portia Love and Preston Love. Written to intentionally plant the seed of literacy and history in our youth, Your Bridge to History takes children ages 6 through 9 along with the Black Boats Matter tour across American South. With us today is Preston Love, a longtime community and political activist who teaches Black Studies and Politics at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Representing South Dakota this year is I Survived the Children's Blizzard, 1888, by Lauren Tarshis. This entry into the New York Times bestselling I Survived series follows 11-year-old John Hale as he experiences one of the deadliest blizzards in American history, which killed hundreds, including many school children. Lauren Tarshis is Senior Vice President, Editor-in-Chief, of the Classroom Magazine Division at Scholastic. And her first picture book comes out this fall. Welcome, Lauren. Tennessee has chosen Light in Hidden Places by Sharon Cameron. This book tells the extraordinary story of Stefania Podgorska, a 16-year-old Polish Catholic who, along with her 6-year-old sister Helena, risked her life to save the 13 Jews hidden in her attic, even while 4 Nazis were living in her house. Sharon Cameron is a #1 New York Times bestselling author whose honors include the selection of The Light in Hidden Places for the Reese Witherspoon Book Club. Finally, from my home state of Texas comes Marfa for the Perplexed by the late Lon Taylor. This book is a compilation of 50 short historical essays about the people of Marfa, Texas, a small town in the US-Mexico borderlands. Taylor was a historian who worked for more than 20 years at the Smithsonian Institution and wrote many of the pieces in this book as columns for Marfa's local paper, the Big Bend Sentinel, during the last years of his life. Martha for the Perplexed is represented here today by Taylor's editor, Tim Johnson. All right, y'all, thank you for that patience while we went through each of those very important but quick bios. So, you know what, Brian, we're gonna start with you. For the first question, we're gonna ask each of you. So this year's theme for the National Book Festival is Open a Book, Open the World. So we wanna know what that theme means to you. So Brian, what's a book that opened the world to you? And how do you hope your book opens the world for readers?
I would say J.R. Tolkien, Fellowship of the Ring. I was a huge Tolkien fan as a kid, and I could immerse myself in different worlds. And these different worlds had different languages and different histories. They had their own geography. They had their own ethnicities. So any of the problems or any of the worries I might have in my reality, I could escape that reality briefly in the form of a book.
Thank you for that, Brian. So what do you hope that your book would open for the world for your readers?
Well, one of the things, the book starts out very biographical. It starts out with a story about me in second grade. And one of the things that I found very interesting was I heard very little about African American history as a child in my classroom. So when confronted with the reality of Black leadership during Reconstruction, my teacher had no idea that there had been a Black lieutenant governor, let alone 3 Black lieutenant governors of the state of Louisiana. And it opens up that world. And there's a huge segment of our history that isn't readily available to students. And right now we're fighting a battle. And the battle's happening in state legislatures and in school board meetings, whose history gets to be told and what parts of American history are passed on as a part of our national narrative. So I think it's really important that books like Monumental are presented and they show us how diverse our backgrounds actually are. America is a tapestry, and I always tell my students American history is a tapestry that is composed of all of the people that are here. And if you pull that thread, each community represents just the thread that's within that tapestry.
That's beautiful. I like the idea of pulling the threads of the tapestry. Sharon, we're going to go to you next. So what's a book that's opened the world for you? And then how do you hope your book will open the world for readers?
Well, it is so funny that you chose me next, actually, because I got my answer taken already. I am an enormous Tolkien fan. I knew I loved your bookshelves, Brian. I just knew it. Yes. I have probably read, I believe I've read Lord of the Rings now about 46 or 47 times in my life. I love those stories. And, you know, I have thought for a long time about what is it about Tolkien's writing that so makes me want to go there again and again. And it's for all the reasons, you know, actually that were just stated. But I also realized that for me, it's because when I was reading those books, I didn't think I was reading fantasy. Something inside me felt like I was reading history, something that was real and just happened to have been forgotten, a world that we had forgotten. And I think that is what drew me in so hard. And that is what draws me into history right now. Stefania Podgorska has been my hero for about 23 years now, ever since I saw, just happened to turn on my TV during Holocaust Remembrance Week and see her on my screen. And she told me through the film about being a young 16-year-old Polish Catholic girl who was destitute and alone. She was in sole charge of a 6-year-old sister in a Nazi-occupied town during a war. And in the middle of the night, there was a knock on the door. And on the other side of the door was a young Jewish man who had just jumped from a moving train that was taking him to a death camp. And he said, "Please hide me." And Stefania and Helena chose to hide him. And they chose to hide his brother and then his brother's fiance until they had 13 Jews in a hidden space in their attic. And that's when the Nazis commandeered their house and moved in. So there were 13 Jews in an attic directly above a bedroom where 4 Nazis were sleeping. And there were 2 girls, 16 and 6 years old, to stand in their way. And they were amazing. They were amazing. Their story is such a story of courage and sacrifice, of love and just humanity, that it changed me forever. And I think that getting to write a story like this that is true, that most people don't know, I think it says something very important. First of all, it opens the world to us because it not only allows us to learn facts about the Holocaust. You know, everybody needs to know what happened during the Holocaust, and we need to know these facts, but it allows us to walk in their shoes and feel what they felt. And we might forget the facts, but that feeling, when you feel another person's triumph, when you feel their pain, that you are not going to forget. And I think that makes stories like The Light in Hidden Places, like the Pogorska Sisters, not stories actually about history, but they are stories of now, because the hate that died with Hitler did not die. The hate that caused the Holocaust did not die with Hitler. It is alive and well and thriving in the world right now. And so their choices challenge us. What are we going to do right now today to stand up against hate? And it is a privilege to write one tiny piece of literature that addresses that question.
Yeah, I thank you for the concept of attaching feeling to history, which I think is not necessarily always an easy task, even though history can have big feelings.
Yeah.
Tim, we're going to go to you. So how do you think Lon's, what's a book that's opened the world to you personally? And then how do you think Lon's book will open the world for readers?
Well, I will answer this question in the spirit of Lon Taylor. It is a book that opened the world to me, but I think it, and Lon and I never talked about this book, but I bet it was important to him also. But there is a book called With His Pistol in His Hand by the great Texas historian and folklorist Americo Paredes, which came out in the mid-20th century. And it's about this historical figure, Gregorio Cortes, who about whom many songs are written, corridos in particular, so Spanish language folk songs. And this book was a way of investigating the sort of the experience of Mexican Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century in Texas, especially in the borderland south of Texas. And in a way, it relates to the book in that Paredes sort of addresses the fact that much history for Mexican Americans in that region was traveling by word of mouth and through song. And the book actually was sort of withheld in a way, like it existed as for a different community for a long time. And Paredes is sort of situating the sort of historical figure within the context of the legend and sort of what it meant to, what was at stake for history and told in sort of alternative ways. And that the book is a version of thinking about alternate kinds of repositories for history and the sort of role of story in our cultural life and the way it contributes to our identity, and how, you know, certain communities have to live under this sort of status of contestation, and the way in which things like song and so forth have in some ways not receive the kind of respect that they probably deserve for what they have meant historically for people. Anyway, Paredes was very significant. And this is the sort of interesting thing about him, was he combined folkloric, historical methodologies to sort of to situate these traditions in a way that many people could understand and appreciate them. So the people who he's writing in a kind of register that if you're interested in music, you could enjoy it, but if you're also a historian and you have a sort of standard of methodology there, you could also appreciate it. So I think that was Lon Taylor's Marfa for the Perplexed, and a lot of his work sort of shares that sort of broad and I think democratic sense of what your source material is, how you relate to communities, and how where your work is coming from and who it is going to, and try to situate yourself to be aware of all the different ways in which you know, you have to be aware of who you're addressing and who you're not addressing when everything, word choice and the manner of presentation and how the work is distributed in the world and so forth. And to me, that was really inspiring about Lon, and it definitely resonated with the Americo Paredes work, which meant a lot to me when I was a teenager. It opened up history and also kind of the way in which all these sort of alternate forms of storytelling coexist in the world.
Well, thank you for that. And I promise I didn't tell Tim to say that, but this pistol in his hand was actually our 2014 Texas Great Read. So that's really cool. Yeah, I like that Lon Taylor is going to be beside him on that list.
Me too. And then I would say like that Marfa for the Perplexed, just to finish to answer the second question, you know, Lon was someone who worked at the Smithsonian for 2 decades. And so of course, and during that time, he published traditional sort of scholarly books and articles. One really beautiful book about the Star-Spangled Banner, the literal flag that inspired the national anthem. But in his retirement, and he was also a person who was really interested in music, and as I mentioned, all these other forms of, you know, the ways in which history relates to all of our lives and the way in which everyone has a stake in history. In his retirement, when he retired to West Texas, he basically took up this role in a local newspaper where he was writing the stories on a weekly basis, but you're like 500 to 1,000 words in length. They're very brief. And they were addressing figures and moments in history that that people don't really think of. They're not formal, generally in the conventional sense of Texas history, to be completely honest. So it had a lot to do with Native American history and Mexican American history and events and things that might seem very vernacular or quite folkish, I guess, to people, but they became the real center of his attention. And not only that, but he relied on, you know, correspondence, family correspondence, and in particular, our local library essentially has something we call the Junior Historian Files. In the middle of the 20th century, there was a teacher at the high school that asked the children to speak to their parents and grandparents about their own memories. And in particular, this was very important because in the beginning part of the 20th century, our town, which had been founded in the late 19th century as a kind of train stop, had a major sort of arrival or influx of people from northern Mexico after the Mexican Revolution. And these people's stories had not been a part of the sort of founding narrative of Marfa, but they were definitely there in the stories of the Junior Historian Files. And so they had never been bound in a book. They basically were just like loose, like assignments that kids had made in middle school and high school. And Lon found a way to really sort of shine light on those stories and to involve them in significant ways in the chapters, what became eventually the chapters of Marfa for the Perplexed, but which were also appearing in our local newspaper. And I think that the book does something which the newspaper was also doing in this instance, which is to really demonstrate that everyone has a stake in history, that his sources, a person who worked for the Smithsonian Institution, his sources were like 12-year-old kids who were writing in the 40s and 50s, and they had something very significant to say, and that their writing had character, and it had, you know, that in 2020 or 2015 or whenever these were published, they still could speak to us very significantly about the nature of our place. And I think that, you know, that's something it's very useful to be reminded of.
Thank you, Tim. Well, Lauren, so what's a book that's opened the world to you, and how do you hope your books open the world to readers?
I've just loved hearing from Brian and Sharon and Tim, and I feel as though I'm going to pick up on some of their themes with a slightly, don't worry, I don't have a Tolkien mention here, but I did not read a book cover to cover till I was 14. And then the first book that I figured out how to read was A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, which didn't exactly open my world, but it showed me that I could actually read books. And it wasn't until I was 30 years old, when I was kind of working at Scholastic in the magazine division where I remain to this day, when I was forced by my boss at the time to take on the role as editor of a magazine for third and fourth graders. And the requirement was a deep understanding of children's literature. So I leveled with him and I said, I am not the person to take this job because I never read any I mean, I read A Tale of Two Cities and then I moved forward. I didn't go back and read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Charlotte's Web and Stuart. So he looked at me kind of quizzically and he said, well, just go read them. So I went on a binge and read dozens and dozens of classic children's books, and then moved into more current ones. And really, the first one I read was my childhood copy of Charlotte's Web that my parents had given me and that I had never been able to read. And that really was the book that opened the world for me. I fell so madly in love with these stories for this age group, and that love became more and more passionate with each book that I read. And that opened my entire life for me, really, my career as a children's author. It took me 10 years to figure out how to write a novel for kids once I decided I wanted to. But I think that for me, my I Survived series and the Children's Blizzard is one of now 21 books that I've written, and I'm continuing to write them. The mission of the book really picks up a lot on what Brian said and Sharon said and Tim has talked about, which is that I tell children history is not facts and dates. History is stories of ordinary people like you and me, and the idea and that history also is we all can give our voice to history. So just what Tim said, this idea of these 12 and 13-year-old children in the 40s and 50s being the source of record for this important event in history really resonates with me. The mission of my series is to, I do an enormous amount of research. I'm looking at Brian's backdrop there, and it's, I have like a dizzying amount, piles of books. I travel to every place that I write about. I undertake, a research project that is that probably could fill one of Sharon's books or one of Brian's books. But my goal is different. My goal is to really open doors for kids to take complicated stories, whether it's an enslaved child who was caught up in the Battle of Gettysburg, the Revolutionary War, iconic blizzard, during the time of westward expansion, and make them comprehensible to children, especially children who don't consider themselves readers, who, unlike Sharon and Brian, were not huddled under their covers reading Lord of the Rings when they were children. A lot of my readers are fragile readers, striving readers. And I think that I remember how it was for me, being deeply curious about the world, wanting to be a part of conversations, but because of my own reading struggles, feeling shut out. So that is, that's really what keeps me writing this series. And the Children's Blizzard book was especially, it was an incredibly special experience for me in my travels to Dakota, to North Dakota and South Dakota, and the number of people that I got to speak to who had memories that had been handed down to them of this blizzard that happened in 1888. And meeting people all across the state. And then, though my books are historical fiction, my characters are fictional, trying to infuse my book, this book and all of the books of my series, with the voices of the people whose stories I either hear firsthand through my travels or that I discover in historical societies or, through memoirs, letters, etc.
Wow, thank you so much, Lauren. And it makes me really think, there are lots of different panels with lots of different themes with different states, but the history panel that we're in right now and opening the world up to readers is really profound. Preston, I'm excited to ask you these questions. The theme of this year's National Book Festival is Open a Book, Open the World. And I want to know, what's a book that's opened the world to you? And then how do you hope your book will open the world to readers?
Shay, I'm excited to be able to answer in the circumstance, and so honored as an author of my very first children's book. This is a double honor, and to be in the midst of these wonderful other authors is a great honor. Well, you know what, even with all due respect for the question, I'm hoping that this children's book will open the world to the children. And it has opened the world to me in that I was not an aficionado of children's books. I just love children, but I really have greater respect for children's book and the impact that they can have. And so that is part of it. But my objective was almost the exact, except for the audience, and opening the world was for the kids, opening the world of literacy, and then also to planting the seed of their own, in some cases, their own African-American history. The book is being read by all ethnicities now. And so it's opening the world to our youth. And we're hoping that because of the book, they will have the desire to dig deeper and learn more about literacy as well as history.
Brian, we're going to go to you. I'd like to ask you, what was your personal connection to Oscar Dunn?
I am an ancestor of Dunn. So Dunn is one of my ancestors. So I'm related to Dunn distantly, and that helps the narrative of the story, because Dunn had been forgotten. There was very little research that was being done on Dunn. Most of the research was done before the by the 1950s. And the dissertation that I did, that would become the book, revived sort of the discussion of Dunn, and people began teaching using the dissertation. And I got a call from a young man just outside of Columbus, Ohio. He and his father called me and wanted to thank me for writing it. And he was in middle school. So you ask, why are you reading a dissertation in middle school? And he said, well, I loved it. So you quiz the kid, and he actually read it. So at the end of the conversation, I asked, how could I improve this, or how could I make it more digestible for young audiences? And it was that young man who said, you know, I like to read comics and I like to read graphic novels. Could you make it into a graphic history? And I had a professor who wrote really the first graphic history, the first real graphic history, Trevor Getz, and it's called Obina and the Big Men. And using sort of that template, we went from, you know, with learning sessions, a glossary, timelines, maps, and we include a lot of those features in the book, so it can translate into a middle school or high school classroom.
Thank you for that, Brian. And I'm actually going to mix it up and go back to Lauren, so you don't have to wait until the very end. We're going to mix it up a little bit. So Lauren, I want to ask you, how have ideas about teaching westward expansion to children changed?
They've changed a lot. You know, I've been writing my series for 10 years, and I also, the work that I do for I Survived is very much connected to the work I do in magazines at Scholastic. You know, the company our Scholastic, the children's publisher, which turned 101 this year. We were founded in 1920 with a single magazine for high school students, and the mission of the magazine was to help children understand themselves and the world, and to help them become clear thinkers and have an understanding of the facts they would need to be members of a democracy. So, and now we have 25 magazines, and they are, they cover, you know, and they're actually these beautiful, rich digital products, but they still have that basic mission. And I think that what we've, you know, I've been there 30 years, and to watch how we have how we have changed, how our ideas about how we should talk about American history, recentering American history, so it's not just on, you know, white people from Europe. So my story is a pioneer story, absolutely. But as I was researching this, I was very focused on wanting to convey to children what was here before the 1800s, that this was a land where there were millions of people. There were people who were speaking hundreds of different languages, of all different cultures. There were people inventing new types of agriculture and new art forms and telling gorgeous stories, and each one was completely different. So the idea of being able to slowly shift how we talk about our country without, you know, and of course here we are in the middle of this just terribly toxic, fractious debate, which is, you know, I think absurd, given that, as Brian said, our history, what's wonderful about our country is its diversity and the idea that it is this tapestry. I love the way you said that, Brian. And each single story is a thread in that tapestry that makes us stronger and more, you know, more resilient as a nation. So I think that that being able to talk about you know, the history of America, to be able to really be in awe of the people who settled Dakota Territory, you know, these families who went often under false pretenses, had been, you know, kind of tricked by railroad advertisements describing this Garden of Eden where anything grew, and then found themselves in a place that actually was known as the Great American Desert, that Native peoples had never even knew not to settle on because of the extreme weather, and yet you know, were able to make a go of it. I think you can honor their resilience and their grit without, while still acknowledging and sharing the stories of the Native peoples who were forced off their land, and the genocide and devastation that took place in, you know, as part of our history. So it's a lot. And I think, you know, teaching it in an age appropriate way, not laying this on the feet of kindergartners, but of being comfortable celebrating that and sharing our diverse history, and also understanding and teaching the lesson that our ideas can evolve. And that doesn't mean that there's no shame in admitting that the way that we've been talking about history has been too limited, and embracing. So I think that's just such an important message, and it's pretty heartbreaking to me to see where we are at this moment.
And on the subject of research, I'm going to go to you, Sharon. So how do you use and access primary resources for your historical research?
Well, I have to say that researching the light in hidden places was a very different experience from any of my previous books. And, you know, this is a bit of a departure for me. I've written fantasy and dystopia and little sci-fi and all kinds of different things, but I've always researched all of my books, I guess in a very Tolkien-esque way, now that I think about it, as if they were real, as if this was a true history. And I tried to be that detailed, you know, with the world that I created. In the case of Stefania and Helena Podgorska, these were two real people. And I was very, very lucky to make contact with Stefania's son. The beautiful ending of her story is that she married one of the men that she saved, and they had a son, Ed Brzezinski, who I was able to make contact with, and I went and met with him, and he shared stories of his mom. He allowed me to read his mother's unpublished memoir that she had written about her time in the war, and he took me to meet Stefania. It is such an amazing thing to happen in your life, and I don't think it happens to people very often, that you actually get to sit at the feet of your heroes. And she was in the very last months of her life. She had dementia. She did not know she met me. I will never, ever forget meeting her. But I was then after, just 3 weeks after she had passed away, actually, Ed, her son, and my husband and I all got on a plane and went to Poland to rediscover her life. And it was a very emotional, raw time. I got to meet Helena, who was still in Poland. I got to meet with children who had survived the attic. We went to the attic, we walked the streets, we went to the concentration camps, and I found that that research not only obviously incredibly informed the book, you know, being able to access those things so firsthand was, I think, probably something that will never happen to me in the same way again. But I find that not only did it just inform the book and make it as real as it could be, but it actually also changed me. It changed me as a person. And, you know, touching on what I talked about before, I went to Poland thinking I wanted to share this story of my hero, Stefania. I wanted everyone to know what this incredible young woman chose to do and the risks she took during the Holocaust. And when I came out of Poland, that was not the book I wanted to write anymore. I wanted to write a book that helped the reader feel one young woman's experience during the Holocaust and experience the challenge that I think that that feeling brings to our own lives. So in my case, accessing those primary materials was key. But it not only opened up the book, you know, to me and showed me the book I wanted to write, it changed me as a person as well.
Sharon and Tim, I promise we're going to get to you, but Sharon, what you said really made me think more about Brian's book. And Brian, as Sharon was talking about, you know, wanting readers to remember feelings and true characters, I want to know how you want Dunn to be remembered in Louisiana and elsewhere. What are you hoping for readers to, or anyone to just to keep hold of?
Well, Dunn represents a shining point in American history, a point of great hope and promise for the African American community. And it also shows a humanity that exists. A lot of times when we talk about slaves or the enslaved African Americans, the way they're represented is very flat, as if, you know, you were born a slave, you died a slave, and you hear very little growth, an idea that they could have been someone who's a genius who was born as a slave, or a great politician that was born as a slave. And yes, there's the Frederick Douglass narrative and there's Sojourner Truth, but we know so little about Dunn, and he's utterly so important to American history. I mean, he's the first African American considered for the vice presidency of the United States. He's one of the earliest judges in Louisiana history. He was seen by Democrats and Republicans alike at a time that is just as polarized as we are today, as like one of the few honest men in the entire political arena in the state. So the idea that you can have political rivals, but they admire you as a person and they see value in what you have to say is extremely important. And a lesson that we should really be passing on to our children right now in the polarized time that we live in. That look, yeah, everybody's going to have different opinions, but we have to remember what we're aspiring to, you know, that we're one nation and we're trying to find greatness and maintain that greatness.
Thank you for that, Brian. Tim, so why is the book called The Martha for the Perplexed? And what is so perplexing about Martha?
Well, you know, I would say Marfa over 20 years or so has undergone a kind of a transformation to the extent that it was a place that very few people knew about. 20 years ago, and now it's a place that gets a kind of a lot of coverage in things like the New York Times and in lifestyle and design magazines. And it became, for a certain group of people, kind of a cool place. All of that is pretty perplexing to begin with. And there's also, you know, if you arrive in Marfa without having heard any of that, you know, you've not read anything in the New York Times about art and so forth, and you don't have a sense that it's a cool place, I think it's still kind of perplexing because, you know, we're at the northern end of the Chihuahuan Desert. There's a vast expanse here. You have traveled, you know, we're like 200 miles away from a population center. And you arrive to this place, and I mean, there's this interesting combination, and there was very beautiful buildings built in the early 20th century through maybe the mid 20th century, at which point there was a population of 10,000 people. And then there's some sort of evidence of military outposts and so forth. And now there's only 2,000 people. So it's a town that has been sort of fixed up, sort of still a little bit empty compared to the number of, you know, there's a lot that going on that's sort of hard to read. It's like, okay, how is there this beautiful town in the midst of this place, but it seems also, it's been fixed up to the time that it was before, where in 2020, it looks like 1945. So that's all very perplexing. So I think the important thing to say also, which is the real subject of the how Lon was trying to undo this perplexity, is that a lot of people treat this as though it were the middle of nowhere, and that look how in the middle of nowhere there's this extraordinary cool place with these beautiful buildings, and they think two things. One, or let's say three things: Wild West, railroad town, or there was an artist who saved it. And the artist people came and they say, you know, so all that stuff, which are the general forms of explanation to resolve people's being perplexed, are just totally unsatisfying. And so I think a lot of work needs to be done. So there's like both the people who are perplexed and a need to address that perplexity in a legitimate way. And so I think that's both why it's called Marfa for the Perplexed, and it's also sort of the purpose of the book is to say, okay, there's no such thing as the middle of nowhere. There are some very interesting people who are given a lot of credit for the way the town looks and feels today, but there is a lot more going on here, and the relationships are more complicated. And to get a better sense of where you are, to orient yourself in this place, you need to do some reading, or you need to sit down and listen to some stories. And those stories, and I think this is something that other people have talked about as well, is like some of these stories are very painful. There's a significant amount of trauma. We're talking about, you know, the train arrives here with basically the military, and they establish the large Anglo-American ranches. And this also has to do with the fact that the military is addressing the Apache, Lipan Apache people. And some of the first groups that come to fight the Lipan Apache are the Buffalo Soldiers. So we're talking about American history in a very complex and very difficult way. And Lon was just going right there. And he did it in a way that almost everyone could read. And to some extent, you could sort of appreciate, and this is sort of a complicated word, but you could sort of, there was a way of like, oh my God, he's sort of letting us in on a lot of the stuff, and a lot of voices are coming in, and the complexity is present. And I think that's very helpful, especially for a place like Marfa, which is treated like it's the middle of nowhere, so if it was almost ahistorical. But I think and for the country at large, like we all know this feeling that the history is very complex, and we're getting very oversimplified versions of what happened and what is happening. And anyway, so that's why, or I think it's like for Marfa, but it's also in general, like it's okay to feel perplexed. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. It's okay to feel afraid even of the history, but you can do it. We can read these stories, and we can, you know, it's important for us to do so.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Now, Preston, what you talked about it a little bit, but feel free to use this chance to talk about what was in the back of the book, like you were saying. What was your motivation for writing?
Well, my motivation is very straightforward. I am a frequent speaker in high schools, and I am a university professor here at the University of Nebraska here in Omaha. And I look and talk to young people, high school, middle school, a lot. And what I found is that they don't know African American history. That includes and underlined and bolded the African Americans don't know their history. And so because of that, long story made short, I initiated and take 40 to 50 high school kids every year on a civil rights tour, all expenses paid. We take them to all of the iconic civil rights venues to teach them their civil rights history. After having done that for several years, I began to realize that I needed to plant the seed earlier for our youngsters. And that's why I wrote the book. And so that's how it all comes together.
We're almost out of time, but I have a final question for all of you. And I'm going to start with Lauren, because we know that your first picture book is coming out this fall. I'm going to ask each of you what you're working on, or what's coming out next, or what you're working on, or anything you're writing that you feel like you want to talk about. So Lauren, let's start with you, since it's a natural step.
I'm working on two things right now. My first picture book is coming out, and it is called Only My Dog Knows I Pick My Nose, but it's really not about that. It's really a book about self-acceptance and unconditional love that I created with one of my friends who's an artist. But I'm also working on an I Survive book that's about a really fascinating train history story that is set in, it's 1910 in Wellington, Washington in the Cascades. And there was the deadliest avalanche in American history that happened in 1910, where 2 trains that were stranded in a blizzard were swept off into a ravine. And it's one of those stories that isn't told, that we haven't really, that hasn't been widely shared. And it's one of those stories that opens up so many different doors into different aspects of history. So I'm really enjoying the research on that one.
I love the range on that, Lauren.
It's true. It was much more delightful to be writing my doggy book than to be plunged into the depths of the death and destruction of avalanche. And I also have a Texas book coming out, which I almost forgot to mention, which comes out in a couple of weeks, which is about the Galveston hurricane. That's my next I Survived book that comes out. And so I was in Galveston. I was not able to visit Galveston. It was the first place that I've written an I Survived story about that I didn't get to visit before I started writing because of the pandemic. But because of the extraordinary record keeping of the Galveston Historical Society, there were so many resources and extremely generous people who were willing to work with me remotely. And then I was able to go right after I finished writing it. Things finally opened up, so I got to go and experience Galveston with this entire picture in my mind. Maybe it's like what Sharon experienced going to Poland. So that was sort of a mind-blowing experience in a way that I really enjoyed, because it was, again, the first time, of course, I'd seen pictures and videos and talked to people and read all these different accounts, but then to walk the streets, see the Gulf of Mexico, lapping ashore very innocently, that was an amazing experience.
Yeah. Preston, what is next? What's something that you're working on right now, or that you want to work on?
Well, I'm working on, well, first of all, I must say that my wonderful honor of having this book as an award book, but I wrote another book which is bilingual. It's the same book, bilingual, but I'm thinking of translating the book into other languages because of the reception that I'm getting from other language kids. And so that I'm working on for sure. On the tour that was designed for the high school kids, which the book is designed from or comes from, we, at the time that I wrote the book, we were not going to Mississippi. And so I may add Mississippi to the book in a different edition. And also, as it relates to one of your questions, because my eyes have been open about children's book, I have lots of new ideas about children's book that will coincide with my passion to teach.
Excellent. So it sounds like there's a lot more to come. Sharon and Brian, we're going to get to you. But Tim, I want to make sure we don't leave you out. So if you could be thinking of a book that maybe is in your collection as a publisher, or a book that's coming out, or one you want to direct us to, we're going to let you answer this too. I just want the wheels to be turning. Sharon, let's go to you.
Yes, so I have a busy fall coming up. I have the paperback for The Light in Hidden Places out on September 7th. And then I have a new book out on October 5th called Bluebird. And Bluebird is probably one of the most complicated research projects I've ever done. It is about two pieces of mostly forgotten history in 1946 that were sitting side by side. One is Project Bluebird, which was a top secret CIA program begun just at the end of the war, coming into the beginnings of the Cold War, that was based directly on human medical experimentation that had been going on in Dachau, and it was created for the purposes of trying to mind control. They really thought they could do it, and they were doing these experiments on unwitting American citizens, and they were hiring Nazi war criminals to do them. And that is Project Bluebird. And sitting side by side with that is a program called Powell House, which was a program run by Quakers in the Upper East Side of Manhattan in a mansion. And it was for refugees coming to America. And it was a program that would basically immerse new immigrants in a atmosphere of unconditional love. And it was a program that was so socially ahead of its time in terms of race relations, religious organizations. It brought together the Jewish organizations, the Christian organizations, both Catholic and Protestant, the Harlem churches where they ate dinner once a week. All of these people were banding together to welcome new Americans into America. And it was just such an incredible experience to write the story of light and dark. And now I'm going to work on art forgers in Amsterdam and baby smuggling.
Whoa. Okay, we're going to end with Brian. So I'm going to go to you next, Tim. What's a book you want to tell us about?
In the fall, I have a book coming out called All Rio to the River, which I've made with my friend, the artist Zoe Leonard. It's a book in two parts. We've made it over the last 5 years. Or it's a sort of a publication in two books, or two books in one publication. One is photos that Zoe took between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso in the Gulf of Mexico. So that part of the Rio Bravo, Rio Grande, where it is made to serve the function as international boundary. And it's sort of the photographically explores sort of the different pressures that the river is under as it tries to sort of like play this role, or all the different roles that we make it play. And then there's a second volume, which is essays and poems and conversations by a variety of people from primarily the US and Mexico, but a few people from other parts of the world. And it's sort of conceived of as a kind of a variety of approaches to the river, where the river is the sort of center rather than the sort of edge of something. And, you know, so yeah, that's basically how it is. And that's a part of comes out in November, and there's exhibitions which relate to the photographs, which will be circulating in the US and Mexico and elsewhere from 2022 till probably 2025.
The idea of the river as a center and not the edge. Brian, we're going to end with you on this question, then I'll do the little wrap up that we have written. So please tell us, what book would you like to talk to us about?
Once again, I'm very much like Sharon in that it seems that we're both perpetual researchers and we're always working on projects. So I have 3 projects that are in the works right now. The first is called Taking West Rock. And West Rock was a small Black community that sat at the bottom of Little Rock's wealthiest community. And it provided that community, the wealthy community, with maids, landscapers. And after the Brown decision, the city decides to try to take West Rock from the Black community that lived there and relocate them. So it'll be the telling of the story of this community, how it was founded, how it was moved, and how West Rock, even though it is moved, survives today through the institutions that were there. The next book is fantastic book, history book on Little Rock also. And this deals with the 1860 decision to kick all of the free Blacks out of the state of Arkansas. So Arkansas is the only state that has a history of having evicted its entire free Black population. And for 2 years, I tracked all of the people that I could find, where they went, what were their lives like, and I want to tell the story of this forced migration. And the last book is a project that I've worked on. And I've done a number of books and papers and journal articles on the Elaine Massacre, but I'd like to create a book that tells the story of the Elaine Massacre for younger audiences.
And all of you virtual viewers, I'm sure you've written down at least 3 books that you're wanting to look. Maybe hasn't been published yet, but will be published or is out there. I just want to say thank you so much to each of our panelists for being with us today. You know, I know we're on Zoom, but it does take work to bring everyone together, and for y'all to make the time. It's just been so great. This has been a wonderful and enlightening conversation about the importance of history and the many ways we share it with readers. Honestly, more depth than I could have even hoped for. All of us at the Center for the Book Affiliates in Louisiana, Nebraska, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas, we thank y'all. We thank today's panelists for your time and expertise. We also thank our audience members, you know, whenever you're watching this, for joining us for our Great Reads from Great Places History Edition. And we hope that you will explore the events pages on loc.gov and enjoy the many more programs in the 2021 National Book Festival. All right, thank you so much.